Shattering Myths, a program like none other, one devoted to the most important, the most neglected, and the fastest growing segment of our society. To those who have finally come to realize that the world's political, religious, media, military, and economic institutions are corrupt, that they're actually counterproductive, and most important of all, that it's a waste of our time and energy to try to fix them. They are broken beyond repair. Our mission, therefore, is to look behind the headlines, to know who is working against our interests, to understand why they are doing so. Because exposing and condemning errant, treacherous schemes isn't hateful. It's the most caring and compassionate, the wisest, most rational thing we can do. In our concluding hour, we're going to do something that hasn't been done for a very long time, thousands of years. We're going to use evidence and reason to explore the most valuable document in the universe, the Torah, which means teaching, guidance, instruction, direction, not law, because its covenant provides the only reliable answer for you and your family. It's God's gift to you. Our phone number, if you would like to be one of the many who are now participating in this program, if you would like to join the discussion, it's toll-free. It's 877-300-7645. It is truly amazing that the nation with the biggest military on earth, a nation whose military and intelligence gathering apparatus are larger than the rest of the world's combined, the nation that prides itself on its technology and all of its achievements, is absolutely paralyzed by a snowstorm. It's not a huge storm. In the most hard-hit areas, we're talking about 12 inches of snow. In the metropolitan areas, it's 2, 3, sometimes 4 inches of snow. And yet, an entire swath of the country paralyzed. You know, this started as some snow, rain, and ice in Portland, bringing that region to a crashing halt. It went back through Atlanta with some freezing rain, and then up through the Carolinas, through central Virginia, and is now up through Maryland and heading towards parts northeast. And yet the answer the government has is stay home. Yep, a little snow, and everything comes to a crashing halt. I am not a fan of the President of the United States. I can't tell you a president that I am a fan of, other than I'm quite impressed with the insights that have been provided to us by Thomas Jefferson, but that goes back a ways. But this guy, what a scum. This is the guy who preyed on the CEOs of America's largest companies, the automobile companies, when they flew into Washington because he summoned them for a briefing, chastising them for using their corporate aircraft. And not only did he 2 days ago use Air Force One to fly 90 miles from Washington, D.C. to Charlottesville, Virginia, to parade around the very unpopular President of France, he is now going to take Air Force One across the country. He doesn't want to have to live in the snow like the rest of common folk. No, he is taking Air Force One across the country into the Palm Springs area, into Rancho Mirage, so that he can hang out on the private estate of Annenberg. And his intent while he's there, according to the president, is to catch up on some of his favorite TV shows. Yes, he's bringing his DVR. I suppose that simply watching them in the White House wouldn't be good enough. There is a malignancy that is ravaging our world. One of the scariest words that can be said from a doctor to a patient is, it's cancer. But did you know that cancer cases are surging 57% worldwide? That they're expected to stay on this pace for the next 20 years? That World Health Organizations are calling it an imminent human disaster? The World Health Organization in the World Cancer Report, which is specialized and focused really on cancer, predicted that new cancer cases will rise from an estimated 14 million in 2002 to 22 million annually within 2 decades. Over the same period, cancer deaths are expected to rise from 8.2 million to 13 million annually. I mean, that's almost unfathomable. That the most deadly disease is ravaging the entire planet at such an amazing rate. And that its propensity to kill and to emaciate is increasing so rapidly, especially at a time when we have come to know the things that actually make a person more susceptible to cancer, especially at a time when we have very expensive and elaborate treatments for cancer. I mean, we know that while there is a genetic disposition for cancer, that's not the leading culprit as to whether or not you're going to get cancer or avoid it. It's personal responsibility. Now, a willingness to eat the proper foods, to exercise, to keep away from being obese, from smoking cigarettes, has the largest effect as to whether or not you'll get the disease or not. It is also interesting, of course, that as we fight, the world lambasts the Syrians for their chemical warfares, I understand that chemotherapy is actually a derivation of the mustard gas that was used in World War I, which is today the principal solution for cancer. Christopher Wilde, director of the International Agency for Research on Cancer, said, "We cannot treat our way out of the cancer problem. More commitment to prevention and early detection is desperately needed in order to improve treatments and address the alarming rise in cancer globally." The report notes that the rocketing cost of corresponding to the cancer burden in 2010, the economic cost of the disease worldwide was estimated at $1.2 trillion. And it's destroying the economies of many countries around the world. You know, this was really to a large degree, and I'm not going to speak of the world as a whole because it's kind of hard to know exactly how each country's policies were put in place. But if you're dealing with the United States, there was a profound change that took place in the mid-1960s. It was under Lyndon Johnson, where he decided that we should have a brave new world, a great society. And the idea of the great society was to cause people to be dependent on government, having government take care of people. And one of the things that he imposed was Medicare. Now, Medicare is different from Medicaid. Medicare was the first act, and Medicaid was designed so that the government would shoulder the burden of end-of-life medical costs. And what you find is that at the end of life, about 85 to 90% of the cost of one's medical care throughout one's life is spent in the last few years of life. cancer happens to be a great example where it's extraordinarily expensive, and it typically is an end-of-life treatment. And the reason I bring this up is that prior to the government stepping in and saying, we'll shoulder the burden, the government will pay, which means it confiscates money from those who are productive to give it away. Prior to that time, if a person reached the point in life where it was obvious they were going to die and that the quality of life was not going to be very good, they didn't go through elaborate means to try to stretch out another month or year. But now, since they're not paying the tab, why not? Also, in a time when the government wasn't going to pick up the cost of your last few years' health care, there was an incentive to take better care of yourself. You know, when rascals and hover rounds weren't provided free by the U.S. government, you stayed on your feet and you continued to try to walk. You stayed more active, less dependent. Things were changed dramatically. Families stopped taking care of senior members of the family because now the government was doing so. It created an entirely different attitude, a different approach, and it's bankrupting the world. And as bad as it is today, look at the United States. Prior to Obamacare, the Unaffordable Care Act, Medicare and Medicaid collectively was the single largest expenditure of the government, followed, of course, by Social Security and then the Department of War. And it's the fastest growing part of the federal budget. So you've got a federal budget, $4 trillion. Annual deficits averaging $1 trillion over the last 5 or 6 years. And the fastest growing contributor to bankruptcy is healthcare cost. And the lion's share of that burden is on end of life. It's on fighting things like cancer when elderly are in the final throes of having it ravage them. And yet, here we find that not only is the population worldwide aging, but the World Health Organization is expecting a 57% increase in cancer. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I understand that we have some technical difficulties on the live stream of the program today with a buzzing noise in the background. We are working to resolve that, but as we do, let's continue to remain focused on the enormously concerning increase in reported cases of cancer worldwide. They are expected over the next 20 years to increase 57%. This particular article says cutting smoking rates would have a significant impact, as lung cancer remained the most commonly diagnosed cancer at 1.8 million cases a year, or 13% of total cancer diagnoses. And the deadliest cancer, accounting for about 1/5, 1.6 million, of all cancer deaths worldwide. And I would go one step further. If you smoke, you ought not get coverage for cancer treatment that's anywhere remotely related to the carcinogenic effect of cigarettes. If you've been so irresponsible as to smoke cigarettes, now I'm telling you that my view of freedom is that you ought to be free to do whatever you want. But you ought not be free to influence others in a negative way based upon your choices. And a person's choice to put a cancer stick in their mouth and puff it into their lungs should not impose on the rest of us the cost to resolve their problem. So if you choose to smoke, it shouldn't be the consequence of insurance because it drives up the insurance costs for the rest of us. It shouldn't be the burden of government because it drives up taxes for the rest of us, makes the nation more indebted, to resolve the problem that is directly related to your stupid choice. The report's authors suggested governments take legislative approaches to, like those they had taken against the tobacco industry and attempting to reduce the consumption of alcohol and sugary drinks, limiting exposure to occupational and environmental carcinogens. You know, the attack against cigarette companies is such that while the world was running ads at their expense to say, don't use this product, as I understand it, in many places around the world, cigarette consumption went down somewhat in America, but it appears that it mostly went down in America because the nation passed and states passed legislation that said, you know, if you want to kill yourself in your own home, that's your choice. But don't you be killing us in restaurants, in public arenas, in public buildings. And so it became very difficult and inconvenient to smoke. And when the laws were passed against smoking, the rest of us looked down our nose at it. If you're a smoker, we look at you as filthy because it's a filthy, disgusting habit. It ruins your skin. You smell bad. You know, it's your clothes, your house, your car. It stinks. It reeks. And so there became a stigma associated with smoking. And so there's less of it in the United States, but still, once you scream when you drive by and you see a teenager with a cigarette in their mouth as if they're being cool. It's stupid. Take responsibility. Make some good choices. You know, alcohol, of course, is also a contributor. And the reason that they talk about sugary drinks is because of the obesity factor. There's a direct link between obesity and things that ultimately make us more susceptible to cancer. According to the report, the next two most common diagnoses were for breast cancer at 1.7 million or 11.9% of the world's population, large bowel cancer at 1.4 million or 9.7%, liver cancer 800,000 or 9.1%, and stomach cancer at 700,000 or 8.8%, collectively responsible for the most deaths after lung cancer. This quote, "The rise of cancer worldwide is a major obstacle to human development and to well-being. These new figures and projections send a strong signal that immediate action is needed to confront this human disaster, which touches every community worldwide." Here's a clue. Become observant. Pay attention. Make wise choices. Take responsibility. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I'd like to return our attention to a story that we reported on a little over a week ago. This variation of it is from Reuters. It is one of the most troubling of our day. It began, as you may recall, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is holding a gun to Israel's head in peace talks with the so-called Palestinians, by warning that it would face international isolation if negotiations fail, a senior Israeli cabinet minister said over the weekend. The remarks by Strategic Affairs Minister Yuval Steintz, who was close to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, followed recent accusations by Israel's defense minister that Kerry was being messianic in his pursuit of a peace deal. What's troubling about this deal, my friends, is that it is all but identical to what Neville Chamberlain did to Czechoslovakia. In the days before World War II, Neville Chamberlain thought that he could achieve peace in our time by sacrificing the high ground of a land that he had no right to give, Czechoslovakia, to the menacing Nazis in Germany. And that by giving that land, which had not German citizens, but racial Germans in it, to the Nazis, what happened is that the most shrill voices in Germany, the most devoted Nazis, said that the capitulation was a sign that Adolf Hitler was right. And the German military, which up to that point had looked at Hitler as more of an annoyance than anything else, and literally had been formulating plans to oust him from power because they thought that he was dangerous. With the capitulation of the high ground of Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, Neville Chamberlain entrenched Adolf Hitler's power, galvanized it, and inspired the German military to war. 55 million people died as a consequence of immorally, irrationally, foolishly, ignorantly sacrificing Czechoslovakia to the Nazi war machine. What Kerry is attempting to do with Israel is identical. He wants to give the high ground of what's called the West Bank to Muslims. Now, these are Muslims who have tried but failed to take it following the Balfour Declaration, when they accepted their own personal fiefdoms but wouldn't allow Israel to have a place to live in peace, who attempted to thwart Israel when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem conceived the plan that became the Holocaust. As opposed to exporting Jews, they were murdered en masse. Tried to thwart the plan when, after the Holocaust, the United Nations gave Israel a tiny sliver of land. Rather than accept it in UN 242, Team Islam in unison brought everything they had to bear against a nation that had no army, that didn't even have a common language, and tried to annihilate them but failed. Then in 1967, Team Islam thought that they would wipe Israel off the face of the map, and collectively, being led primarily by Egypt and Great Britain, who was an ally of Egypt, but also Syria and Iraq and all nations surrounding Israel on the north and east, were poised to implement their final solution. But over the course of 6 days, Israel prevailed. And for the first time, Jerusalem was part of Israel. For the first time, the West Bank and much of Gaza, which Gaza had been part of Egypt, the West Bank had been part of Jordan, were back as part of Israel, the Promised Land. And although most of the world had developed its territory through aggressively attacking others, Israel in self-defense had reasserted its nation. And yet the world could not handle that. And so while the rest of the world claimed places like Texas and California and New Mexico and Arizona through outright thievery, through military aggression, in fact, the whole nation was seized that way, The world said that Israel hanging on to what it had achieved through self-defense was unacceptable. And so in 1974, there was another war, this time where Team Islam gathered together and attacked on the most religious day on the Jewish calendar, the rabbinical Jewish calendar. Happens to be a day that is near and dear to Yahowah as well, although it's not the most important of the seven. Yom Kippurim, the Yom Kippur War. And in some places, the Muslims outnumbered the Jews more than several hundred to one. Their technological advantage, particularly in tanks, particularly in the Golan, was just astronomical. Vastly superior equipment, vastly superior manpower, and yet the Muslims lost yet another war. So unable to prevail against Israel militarily, they took a new tactic and said, you know, that those terms of UN 242 that we have rejected at every occasion, now we accept them and I want them imposed on Israel. And if they are imposed, it'll be the exact same consequence as what happened to cause World War II. Gaza's already been sacrificed. So with the West Bank sacrificed, with this imposed on Israel by collective action of the United States and Europe, where they're saying, you either accept these terms or we will delegitimize you as a nation. We will impose fierce sanctions upon you. We will do as we have been doing, which is to sell 25 times more military hardware to the Muslims who want to destroy you than we are willing to offer you. We will stop selling you repair parts for the military equipment that you already have, so it will stop working. You either capitulate this land and die as a result, or you will shrivel up and die for not capitulating. That's what Kerry is imposing. It's frightening. It's repulsive. And there's a lot of reasons that I'm no longer patriotic. My friend Larry's on the line here. There's a lot of reasons that he has gone from being a patriot, being special forces, being engaged in the most elite aspects of America's military, being a leader in conservative politics, to the position of, this is repulsive. You don't want to be associated with this. There is nothing you could do that would make God angrier, perhaps, than taking his name out of his testimony and calling him by Satan's title and name Lord. But apart from that, this is probably the worst thing the people can do, is to ravage the promised land and to have Israel's enemies be empowered over them. What do you think, Larry?
I think you're spot on. I think the word that Yahowah uses is hoy. You'll hear it oy vey today, but it's hoy in Paleo Hebrew.
Yeah.
That means woe.
Yeah.
Land that's whirling and buzzing winged war machines that force us to give up land. He's talking about America in Yashayahu there, and we're going to have some problems here. You would think with the majority of this country being Christian, they'd know that you don't disrespect Israel and get any credit from Yahowah. So what's all this God bless America nonsense? It's cursed.
Yeah, can I share something? We don't have enough time to share it just in this one segment, so it's going to go into the next. Might even go past the commercial break. But you quoted from Yeshaya, which is Isaiah, for those that don't know the real name, 18th chapter, first verse. And what I'd like to do is set this up in context. And then I'd like to read not only the first verse, but also the second. And in context, Larry, before we read it, because we're going to come up to a hard break here, God is telling us that there is a nation that is directly complicit in the destruction of Damascus. Do you know what the nation is that put in place the pieces that caused the Syrian civil war and therefore Damascus to be a heap of ruins?
My guess is the United States again.
Yeah, because we invaded Iraq, gave Iraq to Iran, and the direct result of having given Iraq to Iran is the Syrian civil war. And we've talked about the process that led to it on many programs. I don't need to repeat it here. Then it says that this nation that was the instigator of the Syrian civil war that led to the ultimate destruction, the heap of ruins in Damascus, is going to be the chief player in thinning Israel at the waist, at making Israel indefensible, where the vast preponderance of its population live.
If I'm not mistaken, it talks about an area that's west of Africa, across the Atlantic,
we're
giant navy.
We're going to get to that. But the preamble is all in the 17th chapter. So there's a nation out there, according to Yahowah, that is going to play an instrumental role in the destruction of Damascus, and that's going to play an instrumental role at thinning Israel at the waist, which would mean forcing the nation to give up Gaza, which the United States has done, and the West Bank, which is what Kerry is attempting to do right now. And then of that nation, Yahowah has the words that we will consider when we return. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. As we were talking briefly before we came up to the commercial break, Yahowah in the 17th chapter of Yahowah, which is Isaiah, tells us that there is a nation responsible for the destruction of Damascus. That would be America. For thinning Israel at the waist, forcing it to give up Gaza and the West Bank. That too would be America. And in the 18th chapter, God speaks to this nation, and he does begin it with the word that Larry shared, woe. And before I read this, there is a portion of it that takes some thinking to understand what it means. It says that this nation, this region, is beyond the direction of the rivers of Cush. Now, what I want to share is that there are two associations of Cush and the rivers of Cush. Now, the term rivers of Cush applies to the location of the Garden of Eden, which is in right around Lake Van, and the rivers therefore disseminate out of the Lake Van area in eastern Turkey. And then Cush is often shown in an alliance with Egypt, and therefore is associated with Egypt. There's really only one place in Egypt, though, that there would be rivers, and that is where the Nile and the Delta, because the Nile is the only river in Egypt, where it spreads out, and there's many tributaries of the Nile in the Delta. Lake Van, from a latitude point of view, is at about the top of the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Delta is at the southernmost part of the Mediterranean Sea. And Yahowah will go and talk about this nation being the opposite side across the sea. If you were to draw a line from Jerusalem, which is where Isaiah was proclaiming this message, right through across the Mediterranean Sea and through the Straits of Gibraltar. It intersects the United States at Washington, D.C. So with that in mind, let me read this to you. This is about a particular nation. Woe, alas, expressing dissatisfaction and a warning. To the land of whirling and buzzing wings, which is from the region beyond the approach and direction of the rivers of Cush. He then goes on to say, and those whirling wings would, of course, be American Apache helicopters, probably the most menacing aspect of America's international prowess. Speaking of this nation, it dispatches envoys by way of the sea, and so in floating vessels on the surface of the waters, the messengers swiftly travel, indulgently and immorally. Of course, America has the largest navy on earth, and we have the most messengers. This Gentile nation, that would be a nation comprised of different races from different places, its people are tall, prone towards intoxication, immodest, in other words, they're arrogant, and they have a propensity to take things away from others, like looting Israel, or how about stealing America from the native peoples and from the Mexicans. They are scrubbed clean, overly fixated with their personal hygiene. Smooth skin, most completely shaven. And yet they are typically reckless. These people are feared from here to there and beyond in a future time. This population, which is comprised of many different races, routinely vomits up and spews out nonsense in a strange foreign language, talking down to others, mocking them, while continually marching off to war based on this condescending and moronic rhetoric, always trying to impose its influence, trying to establish the rules, while eagerly expecting to throw inhabitants out of their land, out of their homes. It aggressively subdues others, trampling them down, kicking them out. It's a country divided by many rivers. That's sobering, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty well. You're talking about an end-time prophecy.
Correct.
You're talking about what brings about World War III.
Correct.
And we're talking about this giant superpower that's sending Israel at the right place. Whoa.
Yes. Yes. Where every aspect, every descriptive phrase that God used to describe this nation fits but one nation on earth, the United States of America. God doesn't like us very much.